I have the honor to introduce our last speaker, Shadia Touqan. She is an architect, holds a PhD in urban development and planning from the University of London. She worked as an architect on a number of projects in the UK, Jordan, and several Arab countries. She has been director of the Jerusalem Old City of Jerusalem Revitalization Plan from until recently, until 2014. She won also the prestigious Aga Khan Awards for Architecture for her work in Jerusalem, 2004. Please, I have the floor.
Assalamu alaikum. I would like first to thank UNESCO, particularly my friend and colleague Nadan Nashif, the Assistant Director General. And I am really thrilled and happy that the European Arab Dialogue Initiative is taking such shape and strength year after year. I will be talking about culture and the relationship between culture and man. And as a practitioner, you will find maybe some of, or part of my talk a little bit more technical and deals with some technicalities. So I'm talking about restoring culture and restoring human faith. Culture and heritage represent, as we know, people's roots, history, identity, and distinctiveness. They embody communities' values that symbolizes their past, present, and their future aspirations. Safeguarding cultural and natural heritage, the humanities' heritage, is the professional and non-professional responsibility, as it is what connects people from various backgrounds and affiliations as communities that blend together within a shared destiny. In the aftermath of man-made or natural disasters, local and international agencies responsible for planning post-conflict or disaster recovery need to follow, and I'm sorry if I say need or must, I don't mean I'm giving instructions to anybody, but need, including myself. They need to follow, or we need to follow, a comprehensive, dynamic, and flexible approach while assessing the impact of these disasters on the condition of the cultural and architectural heritage in historic cities and planning for recovery. Historic cities in the Middle East, such as Aleppo, Sana'a, Jerusalem, Nablus, Fez, Cairo, Damascus, and others were and are still a fine example of living cities, providing shelter, housing, commercial, cultural, educational, and religious functions to the community, that community that is living within their borders and beyond. The destruction of a house or residential building in a historic area, which has been devastated by war, usually means more than the loss of a house, of the loss of a residence. For most people returning from their forced exile, the severe damage to their cities means the loss of their wider home and the loss of a way of life and identity. One of the most urgent requirements in this process for those of us in the field of heritage protection is to identify priorities for assessing and handling and recovering the physical damage in historic sites and ensuring the relevant international laws and conventions are followed. However, before embarking on planning for this phase, it is vital to take into consideration the traumatic and destructive impact of the conflict in all its manifestations and consequences on the local community. So the armed conflict has other victims. Past, recent, and ongoing destruction of heritage is not, as some would believe, the collateral damage of armed conflicts. Many also believe that focusing on safeguarding and protecting monuments and archaeological sites is a luxury that can wait, compared to the urgency of dealing with the most appalling human disaster. However, lessons learned from wars and armed conflicts all through the history of humankind show that destruction of monuments, archaeological sites, and artifacts, churches, mosques, libraries, manuscripts, and so on, is often a carefully planned action by some extreme military groups with the intention of erasing any symbol of the past of the attacked communities to deprive them of the continuity of the links to their history and their heritage. Such determination for inflicting damage on symbols of the other's identity and roots is intended to wipe out the memory of who they were and what they are. Thus, concern from professional agencies, groups, and individuals regarding loss and/or damage to historic buildings, sites, and cities also involves concern over the consequences of the loss on people's culture, identity, and life. Therefore, local and international experts involved in the preparation of professional recovery plans should take immediate and concrete steps to involve the various stakeholders of the historic city and encourage their participation in the process from the outset. The fluid and deteriorating conditions on the ground should be taken into consideration while relevant restoration and conservation laws are applied, physical plans are drawn, and budgets allocated. Now, facing realities on the ground, for us as professionals, we all know and have witnessed, sadly, also well, the armed conflicts quite often results in displacement, disbursement, and migration of large number of people escaping the ravages of war to protect themselves and their loved ones, often at a very high price. Today, with the unprecedented scale and magnitude of the damage caused to humans and properties in historic areas and sites in many countries in the Middle East, there are critical questions we must ask ourselves as professionals in the field of cultural heritage preservation, including, first, whether we are capable and competent enough to cope with the scale and complexity of the current situation and the trauma experienced by the community living in and returning to heritage sites. Also, do we have the knowledge and training to deal with the human dimension of what's happening to man and monument? Third, are we really equipped to understand what it needs to cope with the fear, insecurity, and anxiety, and lack of trust of those who were left behind with all what they have experienced in the homeland, and of those who fled their countries and all what they have experienced in their exile? Can we, as technical experts, make the right decisions with regard to safeguarding our precious heritage in the shadow of such a human catastrophe? Do we, as technical foreign professionals and outsiders, understand the political, ethnic, and religious issues which either started or were affected by the armed conflict? And how can we use the cultural heritage to unify and bridge the gaps between the adversaries? Is working with and including the community's various groups, most of whom, if not all, are traumatized, is it enough to enable us to make the right decisions while planning our interventions? Furthermore, do we have the legal knowledge and experience to deal with claims and counterclaims related to property ownership and tenure, which will inevitably spark more conflict, especially if legal records and documentations were lost or misplaced during the war? What will be the impact of lost legal documentation on the ability to implement the rehabilitation and reconstruction plans? When we advise, advocate, and ultimately include in our action plans the recommendations, the participatory approach with relevant groups and community, and the inclusion of these groups in the decision-making process, do we really know what would be the first step to take on the day after? Who should take this step? What would be our role and when will our role start? Consequently, it is evident that professionals and practitioners involved in the recovery and restoration efforts should consider the inclusion of other professionals specialized in conflict resolution, post-trauma, counseling before and during implementation of general plans and interventions. There is also need to consult the local planners, architects and engineers and lawyers to seek their advice regarding the legal issues related to property rights and references before we embark on finalizing the plans. It is only right that action plans and rehabilitation plans are prepared in the safety of offices and organizations away from the area of conflict, and with the participation of whoever can come from local experts and representatives of the community whose role is pivotal in assessing the needs and priorities for intervention and in participating in the analysis and recommendations upon which action plans are prepared. While all these efforts and plans are needed for the start of the reconstruction rehabilitation process, once peace prevails or conditions are safe enough for the implementation to start, it is, however, worth remembering that realities on the ground are far more complex than the theoretical assumptions made in offices far from the field. Another expected consequence of the conflict would be the absence of proper documentation and historical technical records of the original urban fabric, which could be overcome by the assistance from the stakeholders on whose advice and experience professionals will rely. Thus, the stakeholders will have a sense of ownership of the process, its objectives, and expected outcome. Issues such as urgent and immediate needs of residents returning home to their destroyed houses after long periods of absence should be the first priority to the agencies in charge of the reconstruction process. Special assistance for emergency work should be available to stakeholders to ensure that those most in need will be provided with shelter and basic services. Thus, it is important that the suitability of the established international laws and conventions for preservation and cultural and architectural heritage is examined, and that the relevance of these laws in extreme cases of severe damage to the historic built fabric and loss of communities' livelihood are revisited and reviewed, while conservation and heritage protection practices should continue to follow international laws and standards. In certain cases, modifications and revisions are needed to address the new realities of war damage to the living heritage in historic cities. In conclusion, I will just mention a few ideas that I have, many of you have already. First, the post-conflict efforts should bring together a diverse network of professionals in all relevant fields related and needed to start the rehabilitation and recovery process. It is important also to start the coexistence, tolerance, and healing process within the community while rebuilding, rehabilitating, and reconstructing the cultural and architectural heritage of the historic city and sites carried out by the technical and professional team, whether local or international, in coordination with the parallel to the work of social experts in conflict resolution and post-trauma specialists. Also, legal and property law experts should be engaged to examine records and documentations of property to enable the implementation of the planning process and the rehabilitation needed work. Participatory approach with the community should start from the early stages of implementation, from gathering and analyzing data, assessing needs, and finding solutions, including decision-making. During the early stages of rebuilding the community after war, women should take a leading role in the process of reconciliation, conflict resolution, and prevention of incitements and provocation in homes, schools, and community at large. Women usually play a major role in advocating for inclusion and tolerance, After all, allow me to say, women are makers of life, never takers of life. And we can witness that in all the wars and conflicts that are raging around us. Women in general and women groups and organizations of civil society should be encouraged to participate in the whole process, starting from the identification of areas of concern, priorities and conflicts and obstacles to implementation, and cooperating with various agencies to ensure the success of their efforts. Youth as groups and as individuals should be part of the rebuilding, reconciliation, and reconstruction efforts. Youth can help in building social cohesion, reintegration of alienated groups, countering violence, and building peace. Credible community and the religious leaders should be included in the reconciliation and rehabilitation process. Some could act as intermediary groups and individuals to help promote dialogue with marginalized communities. It is important to create an advocacy platform and develop a toolkit. I think somebody is doing it already for outreach to and communication with alienated and radical groups and individuals. The rebuilding process is an opportunity to promote respect for human rights, diversity, and a culture of global citizens in schools and universities. I'll just touch very quickly on the past of the relationship, the long historic relationship between Arab countries and Europeans in the field of cultural, architectural, and historic heritage. For 200 years, if not more, we had explorers, we had archaeologists coming from various countries such as Germany and France and all over Europe, from Britain as well, cooperating and with the local professionals in the field of archaeology and in developing laws and regulations for preservation and conservation of cultural heritage. I would like to just touch on the example of what the German government through the GTZ in the early, well, about maybe 15 years ago in Aleppo. I went to Aleppo about 10, 12 years, and Aleppo was an incredible living example of how revitalization of historic cities can happen, and that was based on the cooperation between German experts and Syrian experts. They had the most incredible example of building the capacity of architects, engineers, workers, craftsmen in the field of conservation, who together, under their guidance, managed to restore and return the magnificent history and heritage of Aleppo in dealing with housing and restoring monuments and commercial streets. And it is sad to see it now and what has happened. But I understand that a number of the Syrian experts who were working with the German expertise in Aleppo are now themselves international experts working all over the world. And I'm sure one day their experience in the revitalization of Aleppo 15 years ago will come handy in rebuilding and reconstructing Aleppo. Finally, in post-conflict situations, cultural heritage plays a key role in reintroducing a sense of shared history and common identity, bringing together various groups, including opposing groups, within the community, and help in the rebuilding of their shattered lives by sharing their common commitment to culture, to their cultural heritage, injecting hope after years of uncertainty and despair about their future. And thank you. I'm sorry to have been long.